we are, which is that on the one hand we have the NDCs at the national scale that are really aligning with the Paris Agreement targets, and on the other hand we have more and more companies that are actually defining their own transition plans. And between those two different approach, we often miss the central piece of this puzzle regarding the decarbonization efforts, and it's the sectoral transition plans. So we will talk about that today. The idea is to actually create some coherence, otherwise we will have a kind of a fragmented landscape with different methods, different approach, and no way to actually compare those transition plans at the different scales. So in this context, there is an important milestone that has been reached very recently. It's the publication of European standards on the key principles and the guiding principles also for those transition plans. And it's a major step forward, of course, but it will be also a starting point for, I would say, international alignment, because this is a vision promoted also by key actors at the international scale. I could cite the GFENS, for example, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for the Net Zero, or the IGCC, which is the Institutional Investors Group for Climate Change. Those two actors are actually identifying those transition plans as really essential tools for an efficient industrial decarbonization. So we are in a moment of, I would say, intense methodological inputs, and I will see later with the panelists to what extent they could contribute to that. But before beginning the conversation, I would like to open the floor with a keynote speaker. I'm very pleased to hand over to Carly Turner, Sustainable Economy System Leads at the Climate Force Centers, who will share a vision on the strategic role for those transition plans and how they are being implemented at the national level.
Thanks, Lina. I might stand. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming along and being willing to listen to what we're doing in Australia. I'm going to do this in a little bit of a layered way and then come back and talk about why we think it matters and some of the things that actually relate directly to the IPCC report that Lina was just talking about. So in Australia, we have, just as many countries have, lodged our NDC for 2035. Oh, the better. And in doing so, Australia has done something that it hasn't done in a very long time in a deep and meaningful way, and it is really set in place the ecosystem for how it is that we measure and make those decisions. Australia's NDC has been a bit of a journey. We haven't always had a government that believed in climate action, and sometimes it has just been as simple as almost having a headline emissions figure rather than an actual plan. And in the last 3 years, the government has done a significant amount of work to make sure that there are plans. And what that has meant is that we have sector pathways. So in 6 of the sectors in Australia which cover most of the economy, let's see if I can remember them off the top of my head: electricity and energy, the built environment, land and agriculture. We also have industry and waste, resources and transport. And that has broad coverage. Underneath that, what was announced in September when we announced the target figure for the NDC were sector plans. Now, these are the very first version of the pathways and the very first version of the plans, and it might be a stretch to call them plans just yet. They are definitely a stock take of what it is that Australia is doing or plans to do in the near term, with an idea about what they plan to do in the medium to long term. So it's a good start, but it's definitely something that we need to build on. All of was announced with our target emissions reduction figure, which is a pretty big range. It's 62 to 70% by 2035. And we would say at ClimateWorks that means that it needs to be at the top end of the band in the 70%. There was also, very importantly, Treasury modelling released, and that's pretty unusual for Australia to do that. They've relied heavily in the past on modelling of entities like ours, particularly in some work that we've done in the heavy industry space and on the work of others. So it's great that they did their own modelling, showed how they had done working effectively, which is something we want to see our kids do when they do maths, so it makes sense that governments do it too, and then publish that modelling for everyone to see. All of that was announced in a week where we also announced our adaptation risk assessment. So we like to call it Policy Palooza, but it will be the foundation stone for how it is that Australia makes progress going forward. Where it gets really interesting is that flows down into companies and it flows up into what we think are regional transition plans as well. And that's something that we've been giving quite a lot of thought to as we think about hosting COP31, hopefully, in 2026. So we've been working with a bunch of other civil society partners, and using the IIGCC report on what an investable NDC looks like, we are going to be asking the Australian government to show what good looks like next year. So they don't have to redo their plans, but to actually set out what a good investable NDC looks like in each of the sectors, and then test that with investors so that we can say, by the time we get to November next year, this is what good is. We could do this across the rest of the globe. Separately, in terms of harmonisation and standards, we're also doing a lot of work focused on trade and finance as it relates to decarbonisation. And it is there that we are discovering that harmonisation and a clear view on what standards look like is actually really critical. We could argue over what a green commodity is for a really long time and not actually make any green commodities. And so when we know what it is that is and how that needs to look, it makes the field of play much, much clearer, and something that we are very much encouraging. There are two bodies of work in the work that we're doing with other NGOs in the lead up to COP31, and some people think that they're not very sexy and interesting because they are harmonisation of standards and the ecosystem. I think that sounds amazing, so I'm really happy to be here to talk about that with all of you today, because it is there's kind of the adage of what gets measured gets done, right? But I'll tell you a little story so you know why it does matter, particularly on green industrial decarbonisation. I live in Western Australia. In Australia, we export a lot of gas, fossil fuels, and it's very challenging to get the government to understand what they need to do to make a change. And 2 years ago, the Australian Renewable Energy Agency was talking about a program that they had, which was a production credit for hydrogen. And they did a series of consultations. And so into the room in Perth, a bunch of gas organisations and renewable energy organisations came to hear what the credit might look like. And the CEO of ARENA stood at the front of the room in the first 10 minutes and said, so we're very clear. Green, for the green hydrogen in this case, is not made with gas. It is made only with renewable energy, which seems like a very sensible thing to say. It was not understood. Morning tea time, half the room left. That was all the gas people, and the rest of the room stayed. And then that meant that there was a very clear direction of travel in the Australian marketplace pretty quickly thereafter. That was the only incentive at the time that existed for hydrogen, and saying upfront and clearly that it had to be green and that this is what it looks like really mattered. It was also tied to what we call a guarantee of origin for hydrogen. So Australia has developed it's a guarantee of origin scheme so that it's very, very clear when we're making green hydrogen what it is that we're making when we say that we're doing that. And that, along with the kind of clear direction of travel, meant that we really understood what was happening. That is not taken care of in every domain and across every element in the sector plans, but one of the things that we need to do to improve on those and improve on the sector pathways is actually make sure that all of that is threaded through from a standards perspective as well. I might leave it there because I think it would be really great to have the rest of this conversation, but very happy to answer any questions if you have them.
Thank you very much, Kylie, for this overview. I'm welcoming the panelists on stage for a kind of a spontaneous discussion in order to deep dive into those transition plans. So firstly, Romain Poivet, who's a climate and energy engagement lead at the World Benchmarking Alliance. Sofia Cara, research lead at the Climate Finance Hub in Brazil. Ben Caldegot, chair of the ITP and advisory group. Welcome. And Claire Broadbent, head of sustainability at the World Steel Association. Please take a seat. So, beginning with you, Ben, maybe. ITPN recently published a study regarding the transition plan at this scale. Could you tell us more in a few words about that, and actually why do we need those transition plans, but also at the financial way?
The dangers of going first with pavilions at COP. But hi everyone, thank you so much for the invitation. My name is Ben Caldecott. I chair the advisory group for something called the International Transition Plan Network, and this is a network of government departments, public sector bodies working to drive the adoption and use of transition plans and transition planning internationally. And as you pointed out, Lina, we published a discussion paper before COP, or to start a COP, focused on the importance of sector transition plans, kind of making the case for this approach, which we're obviously going to be spending a lot of time talking about. And I think the main reason for doing that is a recognition that entities can't achieve their transition plans by themselves. There are a lot of, they say they reside within a system, within a landscape, and there are external dependencies that they need to think about, but the system as a whole also needs to think about, particularly with government and policymakers. And doing that proactively, which we'll talk more about, helps to drive alignment between the different actors seeking to transition. It might make it easier for those actors to raise capital. It might make it easier for the public sector to be engaged in the transition in different ways, obviously through changing and evolving policy frameworks, but also through the provision of public finance and other instruments that could catalyze and support the transition at an entity level. And it obviously might bring about efficiencies as well, people sharing experiences, understanding common problems, and that creates some spillover effects and also a virtuous cycle of change and a dialogue as things change and as people learn. So that was sort of some of the things we were saying in our report.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we will go for one mic. So building on that, Sofia, I wanted to ask you about the Climate Finance Hub in Brazil and what are the link also with those transition plans, and how is the role of the financial actors on that and the investors also?
So, hi everyone. It's a pleasure to take part in this session with experts taking part here. So I'm Sofia, research lead at the Climate Finance Hub. The hub was established last year, so this is our second year of existence. And since last year, we have started assessing companies on their commitments with climate transition. We have focused, of course, on the hard-to-abate sectors, but we are going to move forward to assess agri and food companies, biodiversity. We were talking about the methodologies before this session. But the main goal of the hub is to provide comparable and transparent assessments. We are using the ACT methodology, so sectoral methodologies to do so. And we use localized pathways. So we use pathways from the DDP, the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Initiative. but we don't have at the moment pathways for all the sectors we assess, but we work in collaboration with the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, with Professor Emílio Larrovea, to get the pathways for all sectors. The hub is funded by Climate Arc, Itaúsa Institute, and the Institute for Climate and Society. So we are in contact with different actors in Brazil and in the UK. And we have here Linda Murasawa, who is leading the engagement with financial institutions. So some indicators that we assess through the ACTA methodology are incorporated into the Transition Arc platform, and then this the score that users can get from this platform is it easier translates the commitments of companies with climate transition. We have assessed 64 companies so far. As I said, more on the hard to abate, iron and steel, oil and gas, electricity, and we are moving forward with other sectors. We have recently launched 2 sectoral assessment reports, one on the electricity, another on the oil and gas sector. So the studies, the reports are available on our website in English and in Portuguese. But what is clear is that most of the companies don't have a transition plan. We rely on 100% on public data. So when companies don't have a formal transition plan, of course, we identify other indicators, other information that translate their commitments with climate transition. But what we want to also do next, in the next phase of the hub, which starts in January, is to work closely with sectors and with companies and support them in having their transition plans. We have also recently, and Luciana is here, sorry for putting on the spotlight, but I know that CIS has translated the TPT frameworks for Brazil in Portuguese, so now it will be easier also for companies to reach this information and have more robust transition plans. Of course, for us at the hub, as I said, as we rely on public data, transition plans will be important to really get the more transparency on the commitments of companies. So we are looking forward to have them. And just one last point is that Brazil is, the IFRS is going to become mandatory for next year. And then we expect to have more transparent information on transition in 2027. So this is going to be a game change in Brazil.
Thank you so much, and it gives us a really good insight on actually what are the tools that you're making at disposal for the companies also in order to support the decarbonization efforts. Regarding the methodologies itself of transition plan, you evoked the ACT methodology, and also I wanted to focus more also on the new European standards. Romain, can you tell us more about the work that has been made at the European scale, and what can we find inside this methodology, like a harmonized standards?
Yeah, thank you. Maybe if we just come back a little bit in the past, and the scene was really well said by Ben and by Kylie about the importance of the sectoral transition plans, because that could actually better explain all the external dependencies on which the companies that will have to not only to transition but really to transform. For some will really have to transform the overall business model, and they, as Ben said, they can't do that on their own. They need an alignment of planets. With the policies, the technologies, the investors, the workforce as well, because there are lots of sectors that will completely be challenged by also the new skills for their workforce and so on. So we need to have an overall understanding of the sectoral transformation that will happen. And as Ben really explained as well, you need to contextualize that where the companies are operating. A few years ago, we have launched what we call the atypical framework. It was a collective of individual experts, about 100 experts from everywhere, including Tom Wainwright. We used to work with you, Kylie. And all the experts really land really quickly on the best way to assess the credibility of transition plans of companies at companies level. And one important point was once again the context where companies operate, and to really align the companies level transition plan with the sectors where the companies operate. And at the moment, there are not so many, and you raised this point, there are not so many sectoral transition plans that are developed really at national level and that really connect the science. And it was really important to see that actually you work with academics, with the expert from Universidad of Rio de Janeiro. And this is where we connect the science, the climate science, the economics, and the technological aspect with the challenge at national level. And it really helped to really connect all the dots from national transition perspective to companies level. And similar to what Kylie described a bit earlier, back in 2021 in France, the French State Agency of Environment, developed some sectoral transition plan for the high-intensive sector. It's really similar to what happened in Australia. And the idea was really to start from the French NDC, which was saying all the industry will have to reduce by 81% the GHG emission by 2050, but without giving any clue on how to do that. And so the French State Agency of Environment started to convene some sectoral working group involving all the value chain of a sector. Like we started with cement, and we have all the cement producers, the cement users, but also the policymakers. And we said, okay, how we will reach those minus 81% by 2050? And based on this experience, on really developing a sectoral transition plan for France, for cement, and then for all all other high-intensive sectors, we said, okay, we have this experience. It should be a good idea to share this experience with a standard, because otherwise you will have a fragmentation of how, I mean, we can all have different chocolate cake, but yeah, you can harmonize the way to produce the chocolate cake, if I can say that. And actually we developed the first standard at European level. It was actually something that was identified by the GFAN, so the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, but also the IIGCC, Institutional Investor Group for Climate Change. They identify the need for sectoral transition plan. And they identify also the need for harmonizing the practices to develop sectoral transition plan. And with this European standard, EN, sorry for the name, it's EN 18074, this standard actually describes the cooking recipe to develop a sectoral transition plan involving all the relevant stakeholders of sectors to actually really provide the roadmap for the sectors to transition. And once you have that, and that's the case, for instance, for Australia, for Brazil on electricity and so on, then you can actually start to provide those sectoral transition plans for the companies to help them to develop their own company-level climate transition plan. So this is why we really need this kind of harmonizations and the sectoral transition plan.
Thank you very much for that overview, and I think that the methodology is really important in order to really address the comparability in the end of those plans. Before going, I would say at the international scale, I wanted to hear Claire about the current overview of today. How are advanced the different kind of industries, and especially the hard-to-abate industries? Could you tell us more about, for example, the position of the World Steel Association regarding that?
Okay, thanks, and yeah, and nice to be here. I'm Claire from the World Steel Association. Our members are the steel companies from all around the world, and I love that you're talking about harmonization and alignment, because that's where I spend my job doing on other types of standards to try to get, as an industry, I mean, steel's everywhere and in all different countries and all different applications, and it's great that you've got another standard which is trying to harmonize on these transition plans. as World Steel, we don't have our own sector transition plan, and maybe we should be thinking about having one. But we did work with the International Energy Agency in the past with their work on steel, and we provided some input into what they were doing. But there's quite a number of challenges. Their sustainable development scenario, which they have in there, these things become quickly outdated because things change. And while steel companies have made plans in the past to decarbonize, to rely on low carbon energy sources, if those industries aren't advancing as fast as the steel companies have expected them to, then the plan that you made in the past isn't necessarily going to be able to be achievable now. So that's one of the big challenges in terms of making sure that the plans that are being made are able to be updated over time. Also for the steel sector, there isn't one solution for everybody. It very much depends on local conditions, the quality and the grade and availability of your iron ore. Do you have access to all this, low carbon or the green hydrogen that we need? And if it's not locally produced, how are you going to deal with the transport of that? So there's lots of those individual factors. If you're trying to look at carbon capture and storage, do you have the storage facilities available there to include that as part of your plan? So there's lots of these sort of moving parts. It's very geographically different, as I'm sure it is in other sectors. But the good thing is that we do have different options. They're just not coming fast enough. And so in the short term, we need to make sure that the incremental or the smaller changes that are being made, I mean, small changes in the steel industry still cost, but they actually represent quite a big tonnage of the emissions that we have. So it's there's a lot of things that we need to account for, and it's going to cost money. So from a finance perspective, I think it's estimated between $3 and $5 trillion to decarbonize the industry. So we need the access to the money as well as the technologies going forward.
Thank you very much. I think it's really interesting to have the steel perspective at a worldwide scale also. I wanted to ask you about the governance, I would say, on those transition plans, and we talk about a lot about the methodological aspect. What would be the main obstacles for the scaling up standardization on those transition plans? What do we need at the international scale? Because we talk a lot about national efforts, we talk about European standards and international initiative. What would be your view for example, the harmonization at an international scale of one shared methodology on those transition plans? Who wants to go first?
Happy to have a crack. I mean, in the speaker briefing, this was supposed to, we're going to have some provocations and a bit of a debate. So if some of these are not necessarily views that are ITPN views, they're my views. But I think there is, so standards, frameworks, incredibly important. Obviously, that's why the work that's happening at a European level is important. That's why the ISO work is important. That's why I spent with a lot of time with colleagues working on the TPT framework. But we've got to realize with sectors in specific geographies, these are inherently political processes, right? So so we're trying to structure a political and policy process, and in some places that's not going to be possible. In other places it might be possible, and in some sectors it might be possible. In other sectors it might not be possible. And so I think we've just got to be aware of that dynamic. We can have a fantastic standard and a framework, but it might not necessarily apply very well to a complex political situation and a political economy in a place. And then the other thing I think we need to reflect on, and I think the decision point here depends on the context, is the difference and the relationship between top-down and bottom-up. So, are you taking a global pathway and then allocating a carbon budget to a sector and then downscaling that to a country? Or are you taking a national target and then downscaling that to a sector? Or are we looking at what's actually possible based on policy, politics, technology, what competitors are doing, what customers want, which is more bottom-up? And I think I tend to view this as much more about, what we're trying to do is to get entities to go as quickly as they reasonably can do. We're trying to get them to put their foot on the gas so they can go faster, and it's all about speed and momentum, and that lends you more to a kind of a bottom-up approach than a top-down approach. But obviously, that's a debate that we're all going to be having over time. So it's just some initial thoughts.
But actually, that's exactly the point of the standard, to describe different, same, I would say, a cooking recipe to develop a sectoral transition plan. It doesn't say, the standard doesn't say who should lead the development of the standard and how it should be technically done, but which kind of principle it should follow, and how to ensure that all the relevant stakeholders of the sectors, covering all the value chain of the sectors, are really involved in the process. As I said, you need to have some policymakers, you need to have companies representatives, you need to have experts, an expert from the country, from the companies, from the sectors, from the policy perspective, from the economic perspective, but also representative from the workforce as well. And it's only respecting this kind of process that then you can lead on sectoral transition plans that are then endorsed by all the sectors and the overall sector. And it's interesting to see when we have developed this European standard, we had for sure the national standardization bodies, but we had also some sectoral institute, like don't remember which one, but we had several sectoral institute. We had also representative from consumers as well, from the trade union. So we have the ETUC, so European Trade Union Confederation, and all together, those people came on the, let's say, a consensus about the process. And then, when, for instance, building on the experience we had in France, for instance, we started by, and it's where it match your, it fit with your approach, Ben, on if we should be doing like from a top-down perspective or bottom-up approach. We modelized the average cement factory, for instance, in France, based on all the different cement factories that exist. The engineers develop the average, the average representative of a cement factory, and then they played with all the technological level, all the different levers that they could activate to actually reach the minus 81%, which was the NDC objective. And by doing that, they landed on the fact that even using all the technological perspectives and levers, they will only land on minus 50% max. That means that you still have 50% to achieve. And knowing that, for instance, only 20% of the cement factories in France were eligible to CCS technology because of the ground characteristic, talking about the external dependencies, or because of the fact that there were no CO2 transport infrastructure. So then you start to really create dialogue with everyone to find a solution to achieve those 50%. So that could be just changing the building practices, for instance, reducing, in fact, the demand of cement production. But if you do that, what will be the impact on the workforce? What will be the impact on the local communities as well? What kind of new job you need to create? What kind of public policy you need to invent to cover the gap? And I think it's pretty obvious for everyone, for instance, from just a public policy perspective. For a long time, for instance, the green electricity was subsidized by by public money in a lot of countries. And I think the same kind of public policies can be used, for instance, to support the development of green steel, green cement, and so on, because, as you said, they will have a cost to implement those green level production assets. And if we don't accompany the transformation with all the investors, the potential from the private sector and the public perspective, we won't reach this objective.
Yeah, I think the challenge is if we look at instead a sector transition pathway, you could say, okay, let's take the steel industry as a whole. Where should the industry be located? You look at where the iron ore is located. In the past, it was strategically located near the coal. We don't obviously want to be relying on coal forever going forward. But then it's now okay. The discussions about these green iron corridors of locating or doing the transformation of the iron ore into the iron. That part of the process where the actual iron is being located, looking at where the capacity for steel is, the access to low carbon energies. But when you try and translate that into either national or company level transition plans, the steel industry is a strategic industry, and countries don't necessarily want to sort of outsource it, if you're relying on steel for defense and for jobs and things. So it's very much key of all the value chain, the stakeholders, from the technology side, from the policy side, also from the market demand, are the customers who are there willing to pay, because it's going to cost them extra money to buy this new decarbonized steel. And I think the key point you made about the effect on the communities, the just transition. If you're deciding that you need to move the iron making part, as some companies are talking about this week, from Europe to Brazil, then it will increase Brazil's emissions. It will reduce Europe's emissions. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? You're locating it strategically. It's somewhere else. You're then transporting on a lower volume of material because you've already got rid of all the waste out of the iron. So all of these different things, the loss of jobs in certain areas as we're decarbonising, I think also is quite a key point in this.
Yeah, I would not agree more with what I heard, but just to make two points that were already mentioned, the need to use localized pathways for sure, and also the need to integrate social aspects, especially when we are talking about sectoral transition plans in the global south. In developing countries, the social aspect is really key. And this is something that we don't see at the moment in the transition plans that we see. And just to share an example, because we recently launched this study with focus on the electricity sector, where we assessed 15 companies that account for around 70.6% of the electricity generated in Brazil. We only identified 2 transition plans, and these 2 transition plans were not robust enough, and then they did not contribute enough to get a high score for companies, because in the electricity sector, especially in Brazil, 95% of the energy produced in the country is renewable, so we expected to get higher results. And because of the lack of data and the transition plans that are really not robust enough, the results were not so high. So we are in contact with companies, and we want to continue this dialogue next year to take the opportunity of having IFRS. And now Brazil is going to launch also the climate plan, Plano Clima, next year with the targets for each sector for decarbonization and so on. So this, I think, is a great moment, especially in Brazil, to work closely with the different sectors in order to get the sectoral transition plans and support companies to get their ones.
Thank you very much. And you were talking about that dialogue. I think that we have time for, I would say, one question. If there is a question from the audience, 1 or 2 questions before closing this amazing panel. Thank you very much for all the participants. If you want to present yourself.
Thank you. My name is Abhishek. I come from India. I run a public policy firm and a consumer initiative which works on standards across industries. We are right now, as we speak, trying to develop a transition pathway for 14 new clusters, greenfield clusters. While in India, standards are coming down from the capital market regulator, which is the Security and Exchange Board of India. so the top 1,000 companies are mandated to report on what you call the business responsibility and sustainability standards. But a major problem is with regards to medium and small scale enterprises. And one of the questions that we are exploring right now is the cost of transition for MSMEs. Is there some kind of work that has been done in that regard? And if there are any benchmarks available, will be very helpful. Thank you.
Happy to have a first crack at that and then to pass it on. I mean, I think SMEs obviously incredibly important, and their importance varies depending on the jurisdiction you're talking about. But obviously, very hard to do this with SMEs. I think we've got to recognize the challenges that SMEs have. One key way of doing this is through the banking system in a lot of jurisdictions. So you use the banks to work with the SMEs. That's going to be really important. And then, a lot of countries will have public finance institutions that specialize in SME finance. And so how do we retool them to support the transition for SMEs? So I think that's got to be part of the answer.
And actually, harmonizations reduce the cost for SMEs, because if you duplicate standards like it exists at the moment, and I think Kaya, there are lots of initiatives that are launched a bit everywhere at the moment, developing some private standard. But private standard will remain a private standard. And if you have different people that ask the same kind of question but a bit differently to SMEs especially, it will duplicate the cost for companies, not only for SMEs, but also for large companies. So harmonization is actually a really good way to reduce the cost for everyone, from large company to SMEs. And this is where the standardization bodies, the true standardization bodies, are really important. And this is why there have been, the ISO was created, I think, in 1947, just after more or less after the World War II. The idea was really to facilitate trade and harmonize the practices all around the world. So, and the way a standard is developed, sometimes some will complain because it takes time, but it takes time because it's based on consensus. And it's not based on only a few people that decide on their own. It's really based on consensus involving different countries' representatives, different sectors representatives, different consumers representatives, being all around the same table to land on the consensus. So then, once you have an harmonized standard, actually, you limit the cost for sectors, for large companies, and for SMEs. And I couldn't agree more with Ben on the fact that the priority in terms of decarbonization is the high-intensive sectors, the so famous hard-to-abate one, and the energy sectors. And then, I really believe, I might be wrong, but I really believe that the rest will follow the movement.
One other thing on SMEs, just to emphasize this, I mean, obviously, so if I was going to pick the two things I would do, it would be banks and then it would be procurement. So, and supply chains, and that's how you get the SMEs to do more.
Thank you very much. I think it's a good way to actually end the session. Thank you so much to the panelists for their intervention, and thank you very much for the audience also. Let's continue the talk afterwards. Thank you so much.